Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
The fourth episode, Cities as Arenas for Social Change, will explore the connection between urban design, social transformation, and political ideologies, drawing from historical examples to understand how cities have been reshaped to reflect and influence the societies that inhabit them. Cities and built environments aren't just backdrops for daily life. They're battlegrounds for ideas, power, and progress. For social transformation, from utopian experiments to authoritarian spectacles, from radical housing models to grand infrastructure projects meant to shape human behaviour. From the grand utopian visions of garden cities to authoritarian spectacles of Nazi Berlin, urban planning has long been a tool for social transformation. We'll explore radical plans like Le Corbusier's Machines for Living, Soviet Moscow's collectivist cityscapes, and the sprawling baroque metro stations of Stalinist Russia, all designed to shape how people live, move, and think. But these lessons don't just belong to the past. As cities today continue to evolve under pressures like climate change, inequality, technological advancement, the question of how urban spaces can foster social change is more relevant than ever. In this episode, we'll connect these historical precedents with the contemporary conditions in cities, examining how today's urban planners and architects are grappling with similar questions. How can cities be designed to create more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive societies? Stay tuned as we unpack how the legacy of these past urban visions still echoes in today's cities, and how they can help us navigate the challenges of the future.
Conrad, Le Corbusier's vision for the modern city emphasised order, efficiency, and the separation of functions. Do you see any echoes of this playing out in contemporary urban planning, especially in high-dense cities like Singapore or the rise of smart cities? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the fascination with stratified circulation is something which was a real Corbusier inheritance. It probably coincided with Ludwig Hilbersheim and other German contemporaries also pursued the same idea at the same time. And even Eliel Saarinen, who's commonly associated with a freer form and with sculptural tendencies in architecture, his book The City emphasised the necessity of conspicuous visual order, which I think was interpreted as meaning clarification and separation, almost on the lines of a factory, in the sense that you articulated the different functional areas within a factory and you gave them a strong articulation. That was certainly a strong Gropius idea, which he probably inherited in turn from Peter Behrens. But Corbusier's involvement in it is interesting because, in a way, his aspirations tended to be sighted away from factories on the whole.
Yes.
And he seemed to seek some I suppose solace is one word, but you could probably say two. I think for source material, he was very focused on the Renaissance and on the classical tradition as sources of order. Hence his City of 3 Million, with that curious airport in the middle of the city, was then surrounded neatly and symmetrically on all sides by towers, cruciform towers. So it became like a greatly expanded Renaissance piazza and the centre of an ideal Renaissance city. Now, how that gets applied in more recent years is interesting, because I think that classical model, people get away from that. They start to look much more they place much more emphasis on circulation, almost casting the role of movement of people, locations of people within cities as kind of fluids along tubes.
Well, what about this idea of the zoning of functions that was so integral or prevalent within the early modernist urban planning strategies in relation to, say, precincts that we have in the current urban context, in, an arts precinct versus an education precinct. Is there a relationship between this idea of zoning of the precincts and those early modernist cities?
Zoning's very old in origin. Greek cities, particularly Greek colonial cities on Sicily and southern Italy, for example, would often have areas cordoned off for noxious industries, particularly the ceramics industries. And there's a section in Athens as well, which was a former ceramics quarter of furnaces and dye works and explosions and components like that. So there was a very early emphasis on zoning within the Greek grid patterning of cities. And I guess it became obscured for us by the persistence and dominance of medieval patterning in between, where there was a mixing of functions within a very dense network of buildings that were hemmed in by city walls and by the sheer compression involved in walled cities. So I think Corbusier was so enormously influential that people would look to his prescriptions on order, and certainly he countenanced zoning and great axes, city streets. It was part of a continuum in the 1920s, as I say. There was Hilberseimer, there was Zarin, there was also Auguste Perret, who of course was a very powerful neoclassical presence in France in the 1910s, 1920s, who was advocating great avenues of towers projected over parks. Also, of course, and I think Charles Jenks was very good on this in his book Modern Movements in Architecture, was the curious lack of clarity as to where these ordering ideas of Corbusier were going. For example, the city of 3 million involved a technocratic elite who were moving in and out of these huge office towers around the airport.
Yes.
With the biplanes clustered in the centre of the airport. And they would come from apartment buildings which were much lower in height and more human in scale, which formed a kind of instant suburban layer or ring around these great central 20-storey, 30-storey towers. And I think Jenks was asking, well, who cleaned up after people as they moved around? So they'd start the morning with punching bags and swimming up and down pools and so on, and then they'd go on to a day in these office towers and presumably then would come home and relax in the evening. And I think Jenks was asking who followed them around during the day. Presumably there was some underclass of cleaners who came and just sort of picked up after them all from one building to another, literally. And of course, the question was where they went at night afterwards.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you talk about zoning in ancient Greek cities, and the idea of separating out noxious industries is kind of common sense, but it seems how that logic has been then applied to everything, including the separation of social classes.
Oh yes, but it's acquired an almost artificial or perhaps an extreme or extended dimension. So hence you would have, say, a distinct arts precinct instead of just a theatre building along a commercial street, as happened in Australian cities up to about the 1880s, when you began to get theatres gathering into clusters around each other, and you did begin to get the emergence of distinct theatre quarters, theatre precincts. In the case of the gallery area, of course, that didn't really happen in Melbourne until after 1968, when the NGV moved down to St Kilda Road, and you began to then get a bit of a clustering with the Australian Ballet and eventually with the Museum of Performing Arts and a number of other buildings gathering down there. But of course the Playbox didn't come till much later. Yeah. And the Conservatorium, well, there was the College of the Arts, which was placed next to the NGV, probably 1970s. And then the Conservatorium, of course, is very recent, it's this century. So the coagulation or the convergence of a particular arts precinct was actually fairly late in the day. On the other hand, Melbourne did have quite a distinctive theatre precinct by the 1880s, of just a chain of theatres up Burke Street, basically, and round the corner into Spring Street with the Princess. And to some degree that was perpetuated in cinemas which tended also to cluster near the theatre precinct.
Yes.
Probably because a lot of them were direct conversions of theatres when the theatres became unprofitable.
What about the idea of, we have an awful lot of new cities being built from scratch taking place at the moment, Masdar City and so forth, lots of them around China. And
huge number in China.
How do you compare this idea of the instant city to modern cities like Chandigarh, for example? The Corbusier's ideas were heavily criticised for prioritising planning over the organic life of a city, and yet here we are again. I mean, is it comparable, or are we doing things differently in relation to these very fast city constructions?
Well, I think some of these new or sort of instant cities actually continue the old 1920s ordering idea, clarification idea, so that, for example, technical cities, I haven't been to Tsukuba, but I would think from what I've seen of the designs there, which were highly classicised, that you would get an emphasis on order and probably a conscious attempt to utilise, I think in the case of Tsukuba, to utilise Renaissance civic space. But there were other cities that were newly formed where I think the emphasis is much more on clarity, spatial clarity, and the opening up of spaces. I think there was an anti-congestion attitude. So in other words, you rapidly built instant cities, but you also built into the design that the congestion was going to be taken out before the cities were actually completed. Now that's interesting because it runs against Rem Koolhaas's idea of the city as a repository of congestion, or that it gains its life from congestion, because you make sure that there are great huge streets, and the streets are invariably deserted as people are inside the buildings. And I saw a number of cities like this in China that were just being put up, not the really large ones that you see in the newspapers, but often just cities based around a single main street, usually 6 lanes with factories on either side, which are clearly designed to give the identity of a city, but they don't seem to have the socially condensing roles, to use the old Soviet expression, that you might have got in adaptations of larger and existing cities.
I always wonder whether the impulse to disperse or overscale a city is deliberate in the way that you're describing. It's an industrial impulse, or it's a anti-condensing impulse, or there's something about the planning of an instant city which leads to a tendency to overscale everything and disperse it.
Because
I don't know if I have much evidence for that. It's sort of always a hunch that when you plan something at 1 to 50,000, it ends up too big.
And I remember, I think it was a number of commentators pointed out that when Canberra and its design passed in the hands of the National Capital Development Commission and John Overall, who was an ex-paratrooper, that he actually brought a paratrooper's vision. I think it was James Werrick who argued this.
Oh, yeah.
That in an extraordinary article in Transition magazine called Don't You Believe It, where he argued that in fact it was a paratrooper's eye view of Canberra that he brought to bear, probably based on the experience of English new towns, which were fairly nebulous, automotively linked expanses of urban development across previously open countryside. And you've got something very much like this in Canberra's fabric of satellite suburbs and satellite cities of Tuggeranong and Belcon and Woden and other places. But also, and I think this is something that over several years a number of us have emphasised in RMIT's course on history of urbanism, and that is that there are dimensions to urbanism that run outside of what is probably almost a dominant pattern of urban training, and that is to see cities as demographics, to see cities as flows of, as I say, people like fluids along conduits of various sorts. There's a great emphasis on transit, on moving large numbers, and on systems. And this is inherently ahistorical. It cuts the system of urban development off from its history, from the history of the cities in which it's actually this further development is actually taking place, because it converts it to a series of systems analysis, really.
Yeah.
And so I think the subject of history of urbanism, at least as we've been teaching it at RMIT, has tended to emphasise instead patterning, and also, to a degree, the idea that there's nothing new under the sun, that a great many approximations to this supposedly ahistorical present actually occurred in very specific historical locations and for all manner of ideological reasons.
Maybe let's go back to kind of history as radical change and talk a little bit about Moscow, perhaps. Where the Soviet Union sought to remake Moscow through grand-scale planning, using architecture as a tool of social engineering and as in the service of the powerful state. Contemporary Moscow, of course, is shaped by very different forces, maybe more complicated in some ways. I'm just wondering how the city's urban fabric reflects both its socialist past, or its communist past, and its present-day forces of capitalism, neoliberalism, oligarchic forces, shall we say, those sort of realities.
Well, I think there's certainly been... Neoliberalism certainly seems to have been enshrined in recent directions in Moscow. You could almost speak of a Putin-era Moscow, in which Moscow keeps expanding its municipal regions and area. I think it's doubled its territory in the last 20 years. Because I think probably Moscow is seeking the status of a mega city, perhaps in relation to Shanghai or Beijing or Wuhan or Chongqing or Chengdu. I think it's probably aspiring in that direction, as it might be said in Australia to a certain degree that Sydney and Melbourne are spurring their ancient chariots along towards 7 million people to see who can get there first and have the necessary infrastructure, and probably Brisbane's about to embark on, if not already has embarked on, a similar journey. But yes, I think the idea of agglomeration is actually almost a pervasive Moscow model at the moment. But it is interesting to compare that with the beginnings of a collective city that was envisaged in the 1920s, the Hannes Meyer plan of the mid-1920s, and the construction of the extraordinary metro system, which was very quickly enveloped by a shift in architectural priorities towards ornamentation and traditional imagery, and the depiction of Soviet life through heroic means, using elements from the classical tradition, great murals, equestrian figures, baroque imagery, the use of a central corridor running between two platforms on either side, which seemed to be applied not only in Moscow but in Kiev and in other large cities, Petersburg and other large cities where you got underground railway networks. I think you in a way, the situation in the Soviet Union was complicated by the shifts that architectural ideology underwent. From about 1930, 32 onwards, in the so-called Volpra period, when you've got highly stylised components designed still to make architecture very accessible to people. Via the Volpra stood for, or the acronym Volpra stood for the All-Russian Union of Proletarian Architects. And from there, you then got much more traditional Renaissance-based architecture taking over from there. So you actually had two major shifts, one around about 1930, the next one around about 1934, 35. And with that, you also got a realignment in the plan for Moscow, which then shifted to, broadly speaking, a Parisian Haussmann model. Haussmann's 1850s model for Paris, with great diagonal boulevards, visual axes, monumental buildings at nodal points so that you would fix yourself in relation to this or that landmark. And that became the dominant theme, and it also became the dominant theme in Soviet urbanism generally. as witness Magnitogorsk, which was also reorganised from the ground up in that case on Parisian lines with city gateways and with ceremonial entries to urban spaces and so on.
I'm thinking about the sort of the control and engineering of that massive change or those monumental scales. Robert Brugman came to Melbourne a number of years ago to talk about his book on sprawl, kind of advocating for sprawl really, and suggesting that a sprawling city was the natural outcome of a free market, and the great counterexample to that was Moscow, which could only be dense at its perimeter because of such centrally controlled planning.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting proposition because I think actually Moscow's conceptual centre seems to be moving increasingly towards the perimeter, both through the acquisition of increasing urban area, but also, I suppose, because in a sense you don't have the rigidity of control that's imposed on a traditional and well understood city centre. So you can do all sorts of things at the fringe of the suburbs that you mightn't be able to do really very easily at all in a traditional city centre. Think of how, for example, you can change radically, or the character of Ringwood or Ringwood or Dandenong. It's able to people are able to change those areas quite radically to degrees that you probably couldn't really on any suburb or city area in further in than Box Hill or Kew or Heidelberg.
I guess, Conrad, I'm also thinking here of, the grand plans for Germania. And this was sort of considered like an absolutely extreme example of using architecture to create political spectacle. And I guess how do contemporary political regimes use urban spectacle? And here I'm thinking of massive parades in North Korea or Beijing's Tiananmen Square and so on as I guess, forums for reinforcing power.
And of course, Tiananmen Square was closely related to the precedent of the Kremlin in Moscow, which was a very large open space bracketed by iconic buildings such as St. Basil's Cathedral and the fortress wall of the Kremlin itself, and the Cathedral of Christ the Redeemer at the opposite end of the Red Square, which was going to be replaced by the Palace of the Soviets. It's since been rebuilt, but it was dynamited, and the Palace of the Soviets was built up about as far as its foundations and did time in the 1980 Olympics as a swimming centre. But yes, I think Beijing's Tiananmen Square was partly formed by extensive city wall demolitions. Beijing had a huge series of city walls similar to those that you find in Nanjing or Xi'an, where they're still in place. But they were mostly demolished in Beijing, apart from some gateways. And Mao's tomb was built on the site of one stretch of the city wall. But they did hem Tiananmen Square in much more, and visually at least the abolition of the walls or the removal of the walls then opened up the space much more, although Tiananmen Square's big enough as it is. And it was framed with a series of iconic buildings. It had the National Museum on one side, and on the opposite side from that was the National Assembly, and you had Beijing Railway Station on one side, and then you had the flank of the Forbidden City on the other. So, in other words, it was not unlike the Kremlin in terms of the iconic buildings that were constructed. Now Mao Zedong's tomb completed the square on one side to sort of form the whole bracketing of that space, and it's just a huge open area, very fairly unobtrusively policed in terms of barricades and of security officials who patrol and sort of gently guide tourist parties and other groups into specific areas inside the square itself. So I think there's been a certain amount of living down of the Tiananmen Square gatherings from from the late 20th century.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you also alluded to, the Olympics and sporting arena, and that was, I guess, something that we'd also covered in a previous episode of the Cities as Theatre. But here I'm also thinking about perhaps another dimension to that, which is the World Expos and how they transform cities, And there's often, a great cost and displacement associated with them, but they often have an effect that might, last far longer than the actual event itself. And I'm thinking the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne and, a series of these propositions that, have been quite signature projects. And I'm wondering, how do you think these spectacles compare to the more sort of grandiose visions of the past authoritarian regimes?
They're certainly closely related to the Olympics, I think, as because there's usually a launching occasion and there's a possibly similar duration, month or two for the Expos as opposed to 2 weeks for the Olympics. And the example I think of that's most conspicuous in my mind is probably the similarities between Sydney's Olympic transformation of the old brick pits and abattoirs region in Homebush and the South Bank of Brisbane, particularly in, I think it was 1988 for the Brisbane Expo, where there was a series of closely coordinated buildings, mostly by Robin Gibson, which then were harnessed to serve the art gallery, the concert hall, the city library. A whole precinct really was formed along the south side of the Brisbane River. It was a very large complex, and I think Lindsay and Kerry Clare were going to be originally involved, and Robin Gibson sort of took it over, which is interesting because then the Clares came back for the gallery building, of course, much later. But yes, it was a series of buildings that were very, very much directed at being used afterwards in a particular sort of pragmatism that you associate with the kind of down-to-earth pragmatism of Queensland in those years, governed as they were by a quasi-dictatorial state government that banned assemblies of more than 2 people or 3 people, as I seem to recall, street assemblies. But it is interesting that you could reshape a city, and the Olympics were often used as slum clearance opportunities. And I think in so doing, of course, that was an immediate reflection on the government, whatever government was behind large-scale schemes of this sort. Now, they could be democratic, visibly democratic governments, as probably happened in London Olympics early this century, or in the Barcelona Olympics where large slum areas were cleared. But they could also very much apply to new precincts on the outskirts of cities of authoritarian governments. And I'm thinking particularly of the Exposizione Universale di Roma of 1940, the World's Fair that wasn't, but which gained a huge precinct on one side of Rome under the aegis of Mussolini. And of course, Germania is the other great example of this, in which Tempelhof Airport, which was being completed in the late 1930s, was about the only part of Berlin that was built to Germania scale. Even the Olympic precinct, enormous as it was, the 1936 Olympic precinct, was going to be replaced eventually by something even more massive. And work had got underway in constructing the great avenues, but it never got much further than that. I think most of the early buildings from the 1930s, from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, were going to be superseded by things that were much larger, including Hitler's own design for a triumphal arch and a gigantic domed building, which itself was the embodiment, in some ways, a rather alarming foretaste of how you might see what we'd still call perhaps legislatures functioning today. It was to seat 100,000 people. Hitler or whoever was going to come and make rousing speeches, and the 100,000 people inside this enormous domed building were going to stamp and cheer. In other words, the whole purpose of the building was stamping and cheering. One sort of wonders whether there aren't elements like this being paralleled in the contemporary United States and the erosion of legislative buildings, at least for the time being.
Going through my mind as you said that, Conrad.
Yeah, it was stamping and cheering. Let's have a rally. and democracy as rally seemed to be the idea. And that was going to be welded into Germania, which of course was going to be the world capital. Paris might have been capital of the 19th century, according to Walter Benjamin, but Germania was going to be capital of the 20th, world capital. And it was going to have an appropriate world scale. But it's interesting because now, of course, we talk routinely about the stratification of cities as world cities or as regional cities or national cities and so on. We grade them not dissimilarly, actually.
We just played Errol H. Tout, composer, guitarist and architect. The piece Spiders is from the Dancing About Architecture album of 2022.
I mean, also, I think one of, you've been describing, very sort of, I guess, explicit examples that have, been captured with, quite iconic sort of architectural propositions. And I guess here I'm also trying to work out or kind of factor into discussion the idea of how some of these elements of authoritarian urbanism exist even in today's cities. And we often find that these are where control is exerted through surveillance or exclusionary zoning and even very highly regulated public spaces.
And it's also interesting because people explore the proposition of inconspicuous regulation as well. I think that began often in had quite humble origins. Robin Boyd was approached to design takeaway centres for the Wimpy hamburger chain, sort of British hamburger chain. And part of the brief, a crucial part of the brief, was that people were not encouraged to linger. They were encouraged to move on.
Hard seats, bright lights.
Hard seats, bright lights, and it starts to get positively uncomfortable after a while. So you move on. And yes, I think that applied at various levels. For example, the Housing Commission towers, when they were built in the 1960s, you were not encouraged to linger there either. So they were actually made deliberately austere with that in mind, that you would aspire to something more comfortable and something more domestic and something cosier than was offered by vinyl tiles and concrete block walls and balcony access. I suspect that may well have applied in a lot of public housing in Britain at the same time, actually, which is where I think a lot of the ideas came from. But so you do get the shaping of space in particular ways. In a lot of precincts in Melbourne, for example, you find the gap between stones or areas where you might sit down is interspersed with little blades of stainless steel that project upwards and are anchored to flanking stones by rivets in various forms. So presumably you can't lie down on one of these and sort of sleep there overnight.
And definitely not skate on them so well either.
And certainly not skate on them either. No. Your skateboard would disintegrate on impact with one of these stainless steel blades. So yes, there are all sorts of ways in which people are encouraged to use public space decorously and possibly for limited tenure, I would say.
I mean, this whole conversation is going towards the contemporary understanding of the city as private space.
Yes, it is.
Corporate owned. If it's an event, it's a temporary pop-up.
Yes.
Quite different from the sort of historic examples we're talking about where there's a conscious engineering of the spectacle in a sort of quite permanent way.
Yes, in a shared urban sense. And I think Melbourne ran into this spectacularly with the city square, that there was a long-standing aspiration by the council that it be a forecourt for a towered office building.
Right.
Well, ultimately, the so-called city square became a forecourt for the Western Hotel, so that you've got a large-scale corporate building that would frame it on one side. After a brief period in which there was a design that attempted to do something with the side of the Regent Theatre, and it didn't seem to work wonderfully well, and so it was sort of the council defaulted to its original option, which was as a forecourt for a public building, which tended to suggest actually, well, it raised questions as to what extent Melbourne either needed a plaza or wanted a plaza ultimately. Melbourne had not been a plaza city previously, and this was something that Robert Venturi raised in relation to American cities who were also determinedly getting plazas.
You're talking the famous quote, Americans shouldn't be in piazzas, should be at home watching television.
They should be at home watching television.
Yeah, well, I mean, on a different kind of conscious planning or shaping of our built environments, I think we must also turn our thoughts towards Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, which was this idea of balancing nature and urban life, almost like a compression of the country life. And the Garden City was also quite a scaleless diagram. I mean, I'm curious how you might think about that idea of Howard's Garden City in relation to the contemporary city. We're seeing a push for the polycentric city, 15-minute cities. How do you think these ideas compared to those early garden city ideals?
I think that the nodal patterning in Australian suburban development probably has elements to do with the garden city. A lot of suburbs, particularly in the railway commuter period, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, styled themselves as garden suburbs and garden cities. Camberwell did.
Absolutely.
Box Hill, I think, pursued that idea as well. So in other words, larger suburban nodes, at least in Australian cities, did tend to configure themselves this way mentally. The interesting aspect in some ways is a conversion of these rather abstract diagrams of Ebenezer Howard and others with, again, circular and by implication nodal points and then voids in between and spheres of influence and of different, again, zoned characters from one part to the next.
Yes.
And it's interesting then to see how earlier planners actually retain elements of those diagrams in their plans. I'm thinking particularly of the Griffins and of their tendency to configure their proposals for Australian towns and cities, and usually involving polygonal or circular nodal components with long boulevards and axes linking multiple nodes or multiple circles. And in some ways this was an extension of Haussmann, who would link his boulevards with monumental buildings that would be built for the occasion, like Garnier's Opera, I think it's a particular one, or the various railway stations, which were significantly titled Gare or City Gateway. So there is a link, even with actually the figuring of quite dense cities.
Yes.
That also has links back to garden city conceptualisations and forms.
I mean, some of these garden cities often ended up as suburban commuter towns rather than self-sustaining communities. Do you think today's sustainable city initiatives like the eco cities are in danger of simply becoming greenwashed versions of sprawl?
Greenwashing is a pretty widespread and very widespread and obviously commercially quite successful development, I think. And I hesitate to sound like the people who used to put postmodernism down by saying, stick a Doric column on the outside and there's your instant history, etc. This is to take one of the triter examples.
Garden on a tower.
So now you've got laminated timber and green foliage.
There's versions of all that.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, because it doesn't seem to, at the moment, it would seem not to have an immediate congruence with broader urban form. There's nothing in urban form, in changes or proposals for urban form, that has an immediate mesh with the texture of greening in this way. It's almost as if it comes as an afterthought, or perhaps you're paying your dues.
Well, it looks good on a computer-rendered image when you...
Well, that's another interesting issue as well, as the degree to which computer graphics actually control the architectural imagination or mesh with the architectural imagination. It was quite dramatic, made quite a dramatic impression on me when I began watching architectural conception shift from lines drawn with a pen on paper to lines or forms configured on a computer screen. Yeah.
I think that's another whole episode in
that's
itself.
That's a whole episode in itself, yes.
I mean, but in the same sort of space at the moment, I think, what's interesting about the idea of, the awareness. And I think at the moment, the extension of the garden city ideas seem to be connected with, issues of, food security. And productive landscapes, but it also exists in a similar way at a diagrammatic level, and there's an interest now in in ideas of agricultural neighborhoods or agrihoods or urban farming.
Singapore and the rooftop gardens or the rooftop farmland and things like that.
And so do you think that these are kind of trends that are basic in some ways, a rethinking of the ideals of the garden city movement, or are they more related to I guess, another kind of important urban idea, which is gentrification.
Yeah. I think there's a considerable element of urban ordering, which may also be connected with gentrification, that you produce harmonious and well-ordered and quiet environments of a type that would suit a better sort of person who would choose to pay to, as the expression used to be in the 1980s, favourite expression in the early neoliberalist era was choosing to pay, because apparently we all could, and that sense that you could order your environment in a particular way. The sources for urban greening, of course, are multiple. I mean, there's obviously just the simple necessity of
cooling our cities as well.
Controlling heat islands, of creating spaces which people might enjoy, or urban spaces that might correspond perhaps to an older sense of urban amenity. And as well, there were elements like the urban forest movement, for example, which was pervasive in the 1970s, early 1980s. It was followed by a kind of cafe society phenomenon, and then quite frequently a kind of almost an aggressively non-foliate urbanism in which we'd all live in sort of completely open streets and get blasted by the sun. To our heart's content, as it were. So yes, there were various sources for modelling cities, and these could be done at a suburban scale, or they could be done at a central activities district scale, or they could be applied in any number of dimensions, really. I think in terms of gentrification, it's interesting too. Gentrification has a strong element of urban emulation in it, because I think gentrified areas often seek out regions that are popular for different reasons. I think the idea of living in Bohemia, urban Bohemia, for example, fueled the gentrification of Greenwich Village, quite conspicuous gentrification of Greenwich Village and that whole downtown area of New York in the late 1970s, early 1980s. There was the development of the loft movement, in which people suddenly took delight in living in old warehouses, and for the obvious associations that they were creative centres, particularly for artists. The American fascination with the left bank of Paris, for example, and with its associations with Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and others, so that you were able to take a romantic journey in your mind's eye by actually reshaping an old urban area to heighten the specifics of those experiences. So there's very much a sense of visual impression that fuels gentrification. It's not simply a sociological phenomenon. It actually seems to have a fabric of strong visual associations, and people would seek out a particular type of city or a particular type of living with a strong visual configuration in it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, also, thinking back to the discussion of Greenwich Village, and thinking that does have a strong correlation to, I guess, the emergent, the kind of writings and theories of Jane Jacobs that stemmed around a similar time, that started to tie in together these questions of sociology and economics, but also looking very closely at its impact on emergent urban development.
Yes, yeah. Well, Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities was crucial. Was a crucial companion to that whole development, because she advocated the idea of the social mix, both of social groups of a variety of social groups, but also a variety of urban activities. So you would have manufacturing, you'd have retail, you'd have living, you'd have recreation, all sort of fused again, almost in a rekindling of the medieval circumstance, where you would have different activities, manufacturing, residential activities in the one commercial, all in the one building, and large buildings in old cities, particularly American cities, tended to lend themselves to this. They had large spatial volumes. You could adapt their purposes and their role very well, and get the social mix in the process. And it was a rejection of zoning. It was a direct rejection of zoning.
Mm-hmm. So, Conrad, so many of the urban experiments you have discussed today, the garden cities, the Radburn Plan, Haussmann's Paris, and I guess even the Soviet and Nazi sort of mega projects, they were all driven by ideals of social transformation, control, or efficiency. Mm. But looking at contemporary cities, affordability remains one of the biggest challenges. Mm. How do the planning principles from these historical models influence housing affordability today? And is there a way to balance ambitious urban design with the urgent need for affordable and accessible housing?
I think that's a major issue, because the experience, at least at the beginning of the 1980s, as found in the urban infill planning of John Devonish and others, which was harnessed for public housing in Victoria, was that actually on the whole, cheaper housing was associated with traditionally constructed 1 or 2 story housing, which in a way militated against grand avenues, grand precincts, buildings of great mass and presence, which were, at least on the face of it, much more expensive to build than simply domestic scale infills. In some ways, of course, that reinforced the idea that Australia could chug along happily with detached houses at 1 or 2 stories indefinitely. But it did become an issue when lined up against the idea of grand and monumental precincts. And it has been pursued both in Australia but certainly overseas, and the idea of great buildings and great precincts which would then house and to some degree transform society through the provision of housing and so on, then ran up against affordability. Now, of course, affordability also was something that as a concept weighed against monumentality, right, or against heightened architectural expression, at least in traditional architectural terms. So that when people speak blithely of rebuilding Gaza, for example, there's going to be enormous expense involved there. In fact, you can't begin to divide up Gaza for desirable Mediterranean beach fronts at the moment until you clear colossal level of destruction which rivals that of World War II, and which required a huge amount of rebuilding all through the 1950s previously. It took about 10 to 15 years to at least substantially, not completely, but substantially rebuild bomb damage from World War II. And I think here, particularly with reinforced concrete buildings being torn apart the way they have been, who is going to pay for that? Before you even start thinking about affordability by individuals. There was a Marshall Plan for that, but there isn't one now. And you've got it in Syria, in Gaza, you've got large parts of Iraq, you've got large sections of the Ukraine, all of which are simultaneously demanding massive rebuilding on a scale that's actually probably far greater than in World War II.
So as we've explored, cities have long been arenas for social change, whether through utopian planning, authoritarian mega-projects, or the push for modernist efficiency. But as we face contemporary challenges like affordability, climate resilience, and equitable access for urban space, the question remains, how do we design cities that serve both grand visions and everyday needs? Perhaps the real challenge isn't just shaping the physical form of our cities, but ensuring they remain adaptable, inclusive, and responsive. Thanks for joining us on this episode. Until next time, when we discuss fragmentation and division in cities. Please keep questioning the spaces we inhabit. You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the Aramati University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.